Demos here that actually walk through some playbooks. I'm going to configure, show a video from pre-recorded configuration of how we set up our switch. We configured a VLAN, hooked up a couple edges to it, and then deployed the entire NSX topology with a DLR. So the ones with the asterisks here, to use the old cooking show analogy where they, they throw their dish in the oven and they're like, I just magically happened to have started one of these 2 hours ago right here. I'm going to pull that little move here, and I'm going to show you sort of how we go through and configure our NSX domain and our switching domain in order to create this end-to-end topology after we already had those switches deployed. So this is what our demo topology is going to look like. The cloud at the top layer of this is really our physical network. So that's going to be a pair of leaf switches that represent a top of rack. The P2V square boxes there represent two ECMP NSX edges that are going to do that routing from the physical network into the virtual network. And then the network in between that and the router at the bottom, that's a distributed router in the NSX world. That's going to be a VXLAN that we deploy in NSX. And then we're going to deploy a VXLAN down there at the bottom that we can connect a VM to. So that'll be like our tenant networking. So our desired end state for what we're going to do here, we're going to have two configured physical switches. We're going to deploy a VLAN. We're going to create an SVI for that VLAN, and we're going to configure VRRP so it can act as a gateway. We're going to set up an OSPF process, and we're going to enable that on an interface, on that SVI interface we created. And then we're going to deploy the two NSX edges. We're going to configure OSPF on them. We're also going to deploy that DLR and configure OSPF on it. So, first part of the demo here is the physical side. This is going to incorporate we're going to create VLAN 500 on my switch. I'm going to create the SVI, configure the VRRP, and the OSPF for that. So I'm going to start off here in my two top-of-rack switches, and I'm just going to walk through the config we have now. So I'm going to look at the config for VLAN 500, and you can see it's not there. I'm also going to look at the interface config for the SVI associated with VLAN 500, and it's also not there. My OSPF configuration, I do already have an existing OSPF process on this switch, which will just kind of go to highlight some of the idempotency of Ansible, where when it goes to configure that OSPF process, it'll actually come back and show me that it's already there. So running my playbook to configure one of my leaf switches, it's going to do this process where it gathers a few facts. And right now, I recorded this up in the speaker resource center, so it takes a little bit longer from there to configure the VLANs than it would if I ran it, let's say, from my hotel room. It was about twice as fast from my hotel room. But what it's doing right now is it's actually connecting out to the switch, and it's trying to create that VLAN 500. So I'm going to scrub this forward just a few seconds. And it comes back, and what it's done is it's looped over a list of networks that I have in my variable file, and it's pulled out the ones that I flagged as needing to have an SVI. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to show my interface, or excuse me, show my config for VLAN 500. What it's doing now is it's actually going through that same structure. So I had my VLAN ID in my variable file, and it's going to loop over that same structure, identify that that VLAN needs an SVI. I have a variable just called SVI that I've stroked to true. And now you can see from the interface configuration that I have an existing SVI, but it's still missing a lot of configuration. So this is kind of the middle layer, the tight layer of the onion. It's done that base level of creating the SVI, and what it's doing now is it's actually going through, it's configuring my DHCP relay. It's going to configure the IP addressing for those SVIs on both my A switch in my top of rack and my B top of rack switch. And then it's going to go through the process of configuring VRRP such that they both have the same gateway address, except it's going to configure the priority on my A switch so that it's higher and it becomes the master. So it's gone through that process now of configuring the basic IP addressing. Now it's going through and it's setting up VRRP on my A switch side of things. That should succeed shortly here. I also, in my variable file, mark whether or not I want my SVR to have VRRP configured. So if it loops over that and I have a conditional that said, if VRRP is true, then go ahead and set it up. If VRRP is false, then just create me an SVI, but skip over the VRRP configuration. So using that conditional is part of what highlights the reusage abilities of the roles that we've created in Ansible. So when I look at my config now, on the next outer layer of that onion, I can see that I have an IP address, I have a DHCP relay, and I also have my VRRP process down below, and it's got a gateway configured. And what it's doing now when we come back to the playbook run is actually going and creating that OSPF instance. You can see that came back green and it said it's okay because the OSPF process itself already existed. And now it's going through and it's actually doing the interface configuration for OSPF. So it's taking my SVI, it's putting it in an area, and it's assigning it's configuring the dead timers and the passive interface status. So kind of that outer layer of my onion. Now I come here and I look at my configuration again. You can see that I have my dead intervals and my hello intervals configured. It's assigned to area 0. And now I have a working OSPF instance on that interface as well. All of this is just for me hitting enter. If I was able to run this demo live, it would still be me standing here talking and watching that go. So from my perspective as a network operator, it saves me a that process off, and then I can maybe go work on something else, which is fantastic. It lets me kind of step back from the day-to-day activities, and I can focus more on design and evolution and architectural aspects of things that can't necessarily be automated. Requirements gathering. So part 1 of the demo hits the physical side of the networking. Part 2 of my demo, I've also called, "Why in the world is this network guy touching my vCenter?" I'm going to go out now and I'm going to create the port group that's associated with VLAN 500. That is the one that I just configured my VLAN and my SVI for on my physical switch. So I'm going to go now from my physical world into my virtual world. Now the good news is, when I run this demo, it's not quite as long as the last one. Now, why is that good? Because I'm still a network guy touching your vCenter. The less amount of time that I touch that, the probably more happy the VI admins are. So this one runs about 30 seconds, but here you can see what I have on my distributed switch right now. I have a handful of port groups, but I don't have any that are called demo. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to run my playbook that goes out to vSphere and it creates my port group. And in about 13 seconds, I have a port group that's been created and is working on VLAN 500. So we have the alternative here of letting your network guy go into the vSphere UI and poke around for 30 minutes trying to figure out the right places to do that. Or we have some automation that allows them to do it in 13 seconds, and it's a relatively prescriptive thing. So you can see here now I have this demo VLAN port group that's created, and its VLAN ID is 500. So I'm now starting to work my way from the physical into the virtual side of things on the vSphere level. And the third phase of this is going to be the NSX side. So on the NSX side of things, what are we going to do? We're going to connect to NSX and we're going to create the logical switches that we need to be able to connect all of our NSX VM networking components to. So we're going to deploy a couple of ECMP edges and a DLR, and in order to do that we have to have all the port groups and VXLANs that they want to connect to in existence first. So I'm going to deploy those things, the ECMP edges and the DLR, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to configure OSPF on those as well. So again, starting off here, in my vCenter UI, I'm on my NSX Edges section of the networking and security configuration. And I've switched over to my logical switches just to show that right now we have one DLR that does exist and a handful of logical switches, but none of them are the ones that are associated with our demo. So we kick off the playbook. The playbook's going to go through and it's going to loop over the same network definition object in my group variables that I configured my VLANs off of. And it's going to identify based on those which ones that I've flagged as needing a logical switch created. So in just a few seconds we have that done, and now we have two new logical switches, one for demo tenant, which is going to connect to our DLR, that's where our VMs would go, and one for demo transit, which is actually going to be that interconnect between our DLR and our edges. So the next phase here, it's going through and looping over just a list of numbers I've given it for my NSX edges. So I want to deploy two of those. So right now, you can see I have one that's in the process of deploying in my vCenter UI. It takes a little bit of time for this to happen, as you're actually deploying a VM to a cluster. So it takes a little bit of time for that to take place. But one of the nice things about this is, have any of you guys ever actually tried to deploy an edge in NSX either? And how many of you guys that come from a network background enjoy hitting the little green plus button and typing in a bunch of IP addressing, going to the next thing in your wizard? It's not the quickest thing when you're used to a CLI world. So that's kind of the other driver for us to go to the Ansible world, is we have this amazing tool that has an API and is a software-defined networking paradigm, and yet we're still going through to the UI and we're hitting the little green plus button when we should really be embracing the UI, or sorry, the API. But myself as a network guy, I really have no background in how to use an API or what that's all about. So to me, Ansible sort of abstracts that a little bit with just a markup language like YAML that we can go through and really learn quickly. So we have 2 edges that have been deployed now, and the next task, this is going through and it's doing the OSPF configuration on the edges. And the edges that we do have deployed were fully configured. It had the default OSPF config when it flipped over there just a little bit ago. So I'm still on the routing tab, and you can see that it shows the state before, and if I refresh that screen, now it shows that OSPF is started. It's got only the 2 areas in there that I wanted configured, and then mappings of those areas to the interfaces down below in the bottom half. So in the time that it's taken me to deploy these 2 edges with Ansible, I probably would not have been able to even get one edge deployed by hitting the green plus button and manually feeding in all that information. And like on our switching world, where we could go through and copy and paste the configuration from one switch and find and replace and paste it in another, there's not even really a good way to do that with with NSX, unless you know how to use the API and you can pull that XML out and do a find and replace in the XML, replace your body, and make an API push back to to NSX again. So the equivalent in the NSX world is really doing kind of a stare and compare between 2 browser windows. Okay, did I get this edge configured the same as this edge? Are all my timers matching up? Which is even a little bit more labor intensive than just doing the find and replace on a configuration file. So just to call one thing out, what this is doing right now is there are some modules that are included with NSX where you can feed it names of vSphere database objects like clusters, data stores, your data center, and it'll connect to vSphere and it'll actually pull back the object IDs for those. Because when you do the edge deployment, the API call does require that you have the object IDs. So that is what these first few tasks here, the first 3 green tasks are doing. They're collecting those object IDs for the data store and the cluster and the port group that this DLR is going to be connected to. So right now it's gone ahead and deployed my NSX distributed router, and now it's going through the process of configuring OSPF on that distributed router so we can get that routing information passed all the way from that access level in NSX up to our physical network. So I come in here and I can see that I have my fully configured interfaces on the DLR. They're connected out to the logical switches that I created earlier. And when I come over to the OSPF side of things, I can see my process is enabled and I have my area configured and mapped to an interface. So that's what I have for now. Does anybody have any questions? If you have questions, I'll be floating around for a little bit afterwards. And I would like to thank you for coming. Please do all of the obligatory survey filing and paperwork that everybody asks for.